Now that we talked about patterns, let's talk about rules for function tables. So here is a function table. Here I see that I have a row that represents x values and a row that represents y values. Sometimes people call these input and output. First, I'm going to identify the two columns that I'm going to compare, or the two rows that I'm going to compare if my data was presented horizontally. And then I can use x and y to determine a rule about the relationship between x and y. And then I want to make a guess about that rule, and then I want to test it out for each value of x and y to make sure that that rule is the same for every pair of numbers. I'll test it out, and then once I determine the rule, I can write an expression to represent that rule, and that might look a little bit like this. So here you can see in my first column, well, not this is actually the first column, but it's the second column where I see 1 and 8. I think my rule might be to add 7. So now I'm going to test that out. Let's see if I start at 2 and add 7, that does equal 9. If I start at 3 and add 7, that does equal 10. And if I start at 4 and add 7, that equals 11. So I think my function rule is to add 7. How could I write that as an expression? Well, I could write that as x plus 7. And then I could also show that on my number line. In every single one of those examples, if I start at x and add 7, I will get to my y value. Now here is another function table that's organized in a different way. Now remember, I'm going to think about, am I looking at the columns or looking at the rows? Here I'm going to look at the columns. And then I'm going to determine that relationship between the two numbers there. So if I look at 12 and I look at 7, I think my rule might be to subtract 5. But let's see if it works in other ways. What about 10 minus 5? That does equal 5. What about 6 minus 5? That does equal 1. So then what happens if I have 8 and I subtract 5? Well, 8 subtract 5 equals 3. So I could go ahead and put my 3 in there. And so I've seen that that rule works for all of my x and into y values. And so I could write this as an expression as x minus 5. Now that brings us to activity 2, where you are going to explore how you would help students solve for an unknown within these function tables. Now we gave some function tables here that I think would be interesting to you. Maybe you want to start to use negative numbers, I'm not sure. But if you do, you have space to create your own 2 function tables and then think about how you would help students explore the rule of these function tables.